But the idea here is that production is not just distributing goods through trade, but in this understanding, production is driven by the quest for profit, to maximize profit. And the surplus that results from every cycle of production is then some portion is reinvested in pursuit of more profits. So the wage nexus and capital accumulation, and the claim that Marx makes, and which Engels definitely builds upon here, is that the surplus, which results from the production process, is actually directly the result of exploiting workers in the sphere of production. So the wage nexus and capital accumulation in this understanding are directly connected. It is the wage nexus that generates the surplus, which the capitalist then appropriates, part of which is then reinvested in pursuit of profit. So Manchester, the claim that Engels is making, I mean, we can talk in more detail about different definitions of capitalism and, you know, Engels' definition, Marx's definition, and other ways of understanding capitalism. And that's obviously just a general overview. But the thing that's important for us is that Engels is presupposing that general idea of capitalism in order to try to understand what's going on in 19th century Manchester. And his claim is that this particular model of class exploitation and surplus value extraction and capital accumulation is spatialized in the industrial city of the 19th century. Not only in Manchester, but as mentioned earlier, in London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Dublin, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. And so this is not the capitalist city as such. It's a particular form of capitalist urbanization. But the one reason why Engels' text is so classic is because he was really the first systematically to explore the link between industrialization and urbanization. So, and again, I want you to keep in mind Burgess and Park, who, like, well, hopefully we can come back to this a little bit later on. Obviously, they're writing about Chicago 60 years later. Obviously, Chicago is also a city that has been forged through industrialization. But please note, I just say this by way of preface before I dive deeper into Engels. Please note, industrialization and the existence of industries in Chicago, it barely even shows up. Their map is entirely a map of where people live. And Engels is also interested in where people live. But as I'll explain presently, he systematically links residential geography, where people live, to the dynamics of industrial development spatialized in the city. Are you all with me on that? Like, this is really a key kind of demarcation point, which I want us to think about. So we did an entire discussion of Burgess and Park, and you wouldn't know. Like, I didn't even bring this critique in because I was focused on the racial apartheid problem, but it's another whole critique. You wouldn't know from reading Burgess and Park and looking at the dartboard that there are industries, you know, factories, slaughterhouses, workshops of many kinds in Chicago, except insofar as the fact that people work is mentioned. So that the trade or the profession of different people is mentioned in the text, but the location of those industries is literally just, it's completely invisible. And Engels' starting point, as I'll explain momentarily, even though he then eventually gets to some of the same questions that concern Park and Burgess, Engels' starting point is industrial capitalism. So he's interested in capital, which on some level empirically refers to where do factories locate, and then how do they procure workers and material and energy in order to support their operations. Is everybody with me on that? Like, I didn't do a slide on it because I just wanted to explain it, but that's, to me, that's like, that's a pretty astonishing difference between these traditions. Okay, let me keep going. So the puzzle, we've got to do the puzzle slide. Yeah. If you ever listen on the news to Marketplace, it's like a business radio show. They always say, let's do the numbers. And then they report on like the day's stock market figures. In the United States, it's like on NPR. I don't know if anybody listens to it, but I listen to it sometimes while I'm cooking. And so I'm like, let's do the puzzle. So it's like in every edition of Marketplace, it's like, okay, let's do the numbers. So the equivalent moment in my lecture is like, okay, what's the puzzle? We got to figure out the puzzle. So I should ask you what the puzzle is one day, but today I'm going to tell you what I think the puzzle is. So the puzzle for Engels is capitalist industrialization and the ways in which capitalist industrialization produces not only new forms of class relations and class exploitation, but new spatial arrangements, new social arrangements, which are spatialized in the city. And the city, to use a term from a different context for Engels, is a kind of social factory. And what I mean by that, it's not just a factory, it's a social factory. That's a term that I get from a different tradition, but it's actually quite useful here. It's a social factory in the sense that what the city is producing is not only capital, but also workers. And let me just repeat that. What the city is producing is not only capital, but also workers. And what I mean by that is simply that Engels is concerned not only with where factories are, which I didn't have you read. You read a little bit on that, but not really in detail. But he's concerned with the condition of the working class, which is how do the workers, where do they live and how do they live? And then, so it's the question in feminist social theory, it's the question of social reproduction. In other words, the capitalist production process focuses on what happens in the factory. But theories in feminism of social reproduction focus on the question of, well, what does the worker do before he or she gets to the shop floor? And how do they survive? How do they reproduce themselves? And there's all kinds of labor, including gendered and racialized labor, that goes on in the sphere of social reproduction. So Engels is interested in social reproduction. And he's interested in production. In a certain way, I'm making the same point I made a moment ago about the Chicago school, the difference between this and the Chicago school. He's interested in the production-reproduction nexus and how that nexus is spatialized. And that's why I refer to it as a social factory. So on the one hand, the city is a kind of machine for Engels of capital accumulation. And he's incredibly polemical in his discussion of this, the ways in which the city becomes organized in order to facilitate maximal surplus value extraction and maximal exploitation of workers, which is why, according to Engels, the condition of the working class is so miserable, because they're really being hyper-exploited, not only in the factory, but in the sphere of residential life, in the sphere of social reproduction. But just as importantly, it's not only a machine for capital accumulation. He didn't do his ethnographic work by visiting factories, even though he could have, since his dad was an industrialist. He did his ethnographic work, his participant observation, by walking around with his notebook and observing. He's an incredible observer of social life, of urban life. He's walking around trying to understand how people live. So in terms of his method, actually, that's pretty important. He didn't have he's got lots of quantitative data, but his research design wasn't, what we would today call his research design is kind of just walking around and trying to make sense of what's going on. And you'll notice from his narrative, he talks to workers, but he also he's from the bourgeoisie. So he hangs out with members of the bourgeoisie and asks them their opinion about different matters. And he has some pretty scathing commentary about what let's just say his acquaintances actually said. And that's also data for him. So he's doing kind of interviews in a certain way. He'll go for a walk with an acquaintance who's, you can imagine them in their top hat. By the way, remember the Edgar Allan Poe essay that we read the first week, The Man in the Crowd? That would have also been a good essay to reread for today. I didn't ask you to do it, but it's literally from the same decade. And as you may recall, it's set in London. So it's exactly the same moment, although Edgar Allan Poe and his narrator is clearly a member of the bourgeoisie looking out at the crowd. And in a certain way, Engels is in that crowd looking at the bourgeoisie with a certain disgust. So here's the puzzle. It's capitalist industrialization. Again, using machinery, using science and technology embodied in machinery and infrastructure in order to increase the productivity of labor. That's my working definition. And how does all of that articulate to urbanization, understood as the agglomeration, as he puts it elsewhere vividly, the colossal centralization of capital and labor, generating spatial configurations, including infrastructures, canals, roads, buildings, thoroughfares, social oppression. I'm going to talk in a moment about his concept of social murder, and also political organization. You didn't really read that too much, but in the preface, he basically indicates that the book is written to the working class in the hopes that it will inspire them to rebel and form a different society, and one would also have to imagine a different city.